Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to Babel on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Dalib of Masechta Ayruvin. Daf 4. Cool Daf, nothing too crazy. We're going to start off continuing our machlokas between Abaye and Rava. Abaye says that when it comes to kilayim, the shear for an amah is 6 tvachim. When it comes to mavui and sukkah, the shear for an amah is 5 tvachim, whereas Rava argues and says the shear of an amah is always 6 tvachim. However, sometimes you use a looser fist, which is a larger shear, and sometimes you use a tighter fist, which is a smaller shear. So we're going to continue on that machlokas at the beginning of the daf, and then we move on to something which we've encountered before in Masechta Brachos, which is Shiurin Chatzitzin Umchitzin Alach L'Moshe Misinai, and we're going to explain what these are, but that measurements and impediments and sizes of walls are Halacha L'Moshe Misinai, or the laws of walls. So we're going to get into that towards the end, and that's going to be our daf. So we're going to start on Daf Gimel Amud Beis on the very last line of the page. Meisvei, we have a kasha against Abaye. Kol amos sha'amu chachamim be'ama bas shisha. Now we have this brisa that says that whenever the chachamim are talking about an amah, they're talking about an amah that consists of 6 tfachim. Uvavad shelo yu mechuvanos. And they're not always going to be the same size tefach. According to Rava, this is a dream come true. This is absolutely perfect. We have a brisa. It's saying that whenever the chacham talk about an amah, it's talking about a 6 tefach amah. As long as they're not always the same, meaning sometimes it's going to be a bigger tefach, sometimes it's going to be a smaller tefach. When we're talking about kilayim, it's going to be a bigger tefach, meaning that your fingers are not tightly clenched together. Rather, it's your fingers are more spread out in this fistful, and you can get more in there. That is going to be the tefachim that we're talking about when it comes to kilayim. We're going to have 6 of these bigger tefachim in our amah for measuring kilayim. And when it comes to sukkah and mavui, which we need to be more stringent, so then we're going to use a tighter tefach, which gets less in it. Abaye kasha. But according to Abaye, it's a problem, because here we have a brisa that's saying that whenever the chachamim say an amah, it's talking about a 6 tefach amah. Abaye, of course, disagrees. Now, Abaye would say that when it comes to sukkah, when it comes to mavui, we're talking about a 5 tefach amah. So what does he do with this brisa? After all, Abaye is an amora. Can't argue on a brisa. Omelach Abaye ema amas kilayim be'ama bas shisha. So Abaye responds and he says, let's just tweak the words of the brisa shtickle. So the brisa currently says, Kol amos sha'amu chacham ba'ama bas shisha. So the brisa says that whenever the chacham talk about an amah, it is a 6 tefach amah. So Abaye suggests, why don't we just kind of use a shtickle poetic license over here and switch around the words a little bit and say, amas kilayim be'ama bas shisha. That instead of saying, Kol amos sha'amu chacham, that all of the amos are 6 tefach amos, just say, amas kilayim be'ama bas shisha. That the amah, when it comes to kilayim, is a 6 tefach amah. But that's it. When it would come to sukkah, when it would come to mavui, it would be a 5 tefach amah. V'hamu diktani seifa, Reb Shimon ben Gamliel omer, Kol amos sha'amu chachamim b'kilayim be'ama bas shisha, uvad shlim tzumtzamos mechlal detanakama kol amos kamer. Let's read that again. So the Gemara says, but one second, Abaye, you can't say that the Tanakama over there, that this brisa is saying that only by kilayim we're talking about a 6 tefach amah, because the brisa does not end there. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel argues on the Tanna Kama. And what does he say? So, V'amidiktani seifa, from the fact that if you continue reading that brisa and you get to the seifa of that brisa, Reb Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says, i.e. he argues on the Tanna Kama, and he says, Kol amos shamu chacham b'kilayim be'ama bas shisha, that whenever the chachamim say in amah, when it comes to kilayim, it's a 6 tefach amah. As long as they're not going to be exact, strict tfachim. So focusing on the first part of Reb Shimon Gamliel's statement, which is that whenever the chachamim say by kilayim in amah, it means a 6 tefach amah. Well, doesn't that imply that according to the Tanna Kama, all kilayim, all amos are 6 tefach amos, right? Meaning, the Tanna Kama said that all amas that the Chachamim said are 6 tefach amas. Now, comes Reb Shimon ben Gamliel to argue and say, no, only by kilayim is the amah that we're talking about a 6 tefach amah. However, by sukkah and by mavoi, he doesn't say this explicitly, but the implication being that by sukkah and by mavoi, it would be a 5 tefach amah. So now the question is, how could Abaye argue that the Tanna Kama is saying that the Tanna Kama is only referring to kilayim, if Reb Shimon ben Gamliel is arguing on the Tanna Kama and he's the one saying that the 6 tefach amah is only by kilayim, implying that according to the Tanna Kama, whenever the Chachamim say tefach, it means amah, it means a 6 tefach amah. So fine, okay, good kasha, but Abaye will respond and say, you know what, fine, so the Tanna Kama does, I can't make sense according to the Tanna Kama, but I make sense according to Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel seems to be saying the same exact thing that I'm saying. Ana da'ami Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. I say like Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. And I think I pointed out recently that it seems like whenever Reb Shimon ben Gamliel comes up in a Mishnah or a Brisa or something, we paskin like him. I can't say that we're paskin like him here, but like, generally we would say, Yachid v'rabim, Halacha v'rabim, that when you have a machlokas between one person and many people, we'd go by the many people. So like, why would Abaye want to say that he holds like Reb Shimon ben Gamliel? But the Chacham argue on Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. You're basically choosing the losing side in the argument. But if you say that Reb Shimon ben Gamliel is unique, so then maybe, it's not such a bad idea to argue that Reb Shimon ben Gamliel holds like you. Anyways, so we tried to ask a kasha on Abaye from this brisa, but it turns out that this brisa is actually a machlokas, and Reb Shimon ben Gamliel would fit Abaye would fit just fine with Reb Shimon ben Gamliel's understanding. L'Abaye vade tanoihi. So now, according to Abaye, this brisa is certainly a machlokas tanoim, right? Or really, it's certainly a machlokas tanoim regarding is an amah talking about, is an amah always 6 tfachim, or are there times when it's 5 tfachim? According to Abaye, it's certainly a machlokas tanoim. The Tanna Kama would say that an amah is always 6 tfachim, whereas Reb Shimon ben Gamliel would say that by kilayim, an amah is 6 tfachim, but there are going to be other cases, such as sukkah and mavui, where it's going to be 5 tfachim. The Rava milema tanoihi. However, according to Rava is going to argue that maybe Reb Shimon ben Gamliel also agrees that an amah is always 6 tfachim. Rava is going to argue, right? Again, Rava's opinion is that an amah is always 6 tfachim. And Rava is going to argue that both the Tanna Kama and Reb Shimon ben Gamliel agree with his view that an amah is always 6 tfachim. Let's see how. Amr lach Rava Rav is going to say to you, Reb Shimon ben Gamliel ha'asa la'ashma'inon. This is what Reb Shimon ben Gamliel is coming to tell us. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, according to Rava, does not argue on the Tana Kama. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel agrees with the Tana Kama. He's coming to explain the Tana Kama. The Tana Kama said that whenever the Chachamim say in amah, it means an amah consisting of 6 tfachim. And then the Tana Kama continued, right? Just to quote the Tana Kama, "Uvavad shelo yuhu mechuvanos." But this 6 tefach amah, the tfachim that comprise this amah are not always going to be the same tefach, right? Sometimes they're going to be larger tfachim, sometimes they're going to be smaller tfachim. And comes Reb Shimon Gamliel to say, "Amas kilayim lo yitzamtzem." That when it comes to kilayim, we're not talking about big. When it comes to kilayim, we're dafka talking about big tfachim, right? Lo yitzamtzem. Don't clench your fist tightly. Don't make small tfachim when it comes to kilayim. Kilayim is going to be the larger tfachim. So, according to Rava, both the Tana Kama and Reb Shimon ben Gamliel agree that every time the Chacham talk about an amah, we're talking about a 6 tefach amah. And Reb Shimon ben Gamliel is merely coming to explain that when it comes to kilayim, the 6 tefachim that we're talking about are larger tefachim. V'lema amos kilayim lo yitzamtzem. But the Gemara asks, if that was the case, let's take a look for a second at what exactly Reb Shimon Gamliel said. He said, Kol amos she'amu chacham bekilayim, that whenever the chacham are talking about an amah in the context of kilayim, be'amah bas shisha v'vad shelo yu mitzumtzamos. It's talking about an amah that consists of 6 tfachim, as long as they're not very tight tfachim. So now, if what Rav is saying is correct, that Reb Shimon Gamliel is merely coming to explain the Tana Kama and say that the 6 tfachim that the Tana Kama is talking about are larger tfachim, so all he needed to say was, Vilema, says the Gemara, Amas kilayim lo yitzamtzem, that the amah in the context of kilayim, do not clench your fist tightly. Do not make a small fist. He did not need to say anything about the 6 tfachim. Again, if we read Reb Shimon Gamliel, he says, Kol amu shamu chacham b'kilayim be'amas bas shisha uvavad shelo yu mitzumtzamos. He dafka makes a point that when it comes to kilayim, not just that they shouldn't be tightly clenched fist, but he also says that it's a 6 tefach amah, which does have certain implications that there are going to be other places where it's not a 6 tefach amah. So ba'amas ba'shisha l'mutei mai, when he goes out of his way to say that by kilayim it's dafka and amah ba'shisha, what's it coming to exclude? Where's the place that it's going to be a 5 tefach amah? Lav l'mutei amas sukkah v'amas mavui is not like Abaye is trying to argue that Reb Shimon ben Gamliel would say that by sukkah and by mavui we'd be talking about a 5 tefach amah. Lo. The Gemara says no. At least according to Rava. Rava is going to argue no. Reb Shimon ben Gamliel and the Tana Kama both agree that by mavui, that by sukkah, that by kilayim, we're talking about a 6 tefach amah. Lim'ute amah yisod ve'amah sovev. When Reb Shimon ben Gamliel is talking about a 5 tefach amah, when Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says that by kilayim we're talking about a 6 tefach amah, and they have to be larger tfachim. And we're zooming in on the fact that he says 6 tfachim in the amah by kilayim, to imply that there's going to be somewhere else where it's 5 tfachim to an amah. What is that place? So Rav is going to answer, that place is by the Mizbeach. That when it comes to the Mizbeach, parts of the Mizbeach HaChitzon, the entirety of the Mizbeach Hazav. Let's take a look at the Mizbeach HaChitzon for now. That by the Mizbeach HaChitzon, there are going to be certain parts that their amah is defined by a 5 tefach amah. right? The psukim in Parshas Truma explain the dimensions of the Mizbeach, and it defines the dimensions of the Mizbeach in amos. Now, the interesting thing the Gemara is pointing out is that those amos aren't always the same amos. Sometimes when it comes to the amah measurement on the Mizbeach, it's talking about a 6 tefach amah, and other times when the Torah is describing the dimensions of the Mizbeach in amos, it's talking about 5 tefach amos. So where is it talking about 5 tefach amos by the Mizbeach? Amah Yisod va'amah Sovev. The amah of the Yisod and the Sovev. I will do my best to explain this in words, but I have also supplied a diagram which will make it much easier to visualize. So, if you're looking at the diagram, which I actually forgot to bring upstairs with me, but don't worry, I know it. So if you look at that diagram of the Mizbeach HaChitzon, so all the way on the bottom, there is that section that's sort of, right, there's like different layers of the Mizbeach. There's the bottom layer all the way at the bottom, it's called the Sovev, right? Basically going all around the Mizbeach, there was this area called the Sovev, and sometimes the Kohen, when he would offer a korban, he would like pour the blood on the Sovev, on that area. Now, above the Sovev, no, I'm sorry, I said Sovev, dang it, that's the Yisod, I'm sorry, that's the Yisod. The bottom area is the Yisod, the foundation of the Mizbeach. Now, right above the Yisod is the Sovev. Now, that Sovev is 5 Tvachim tall, okay? And that is more like inner than the Yisod. Okay, I actually just brought up the diagram so I can have it in front of me, which just underscores the fact that it would probably be helpful to have a diagram in front of you as well, right? So the bottom section, which is 1 amah high, was the Yisod, and then it goes in for an amah, okay? And then the next 5 amos of the height of the Mizbeach is the Sovev, okay? And then it once again steps in an amah. And then there's another 3 amos of the Mizbeach in its height. And then there's another 1 amah, which is the horn, which is like the corner of the top of the Mizbeach. So, what we're saying over here is that, when it comes to the amah of the Yisod, right? So, the amah of the height of the Yisod, I'm just going to assume that you're looking at the diagram, that amah is a 5 tefach amah, okay? And then it goes inward 1 amah to get to the Sovev. That amah is just a regular old 6 tefach amah. But then it goes up for another 5 amos of the Sovev. That's also just regular amos. But then it goes in again to get to the next section of the Mizbeach. Now, that inwards amah is another 5 tefach amah, okay? And then it goes up again 3 amos, those are regular amos, and then you get to the corner of the Mizbeach, and the corner of the Mizbeach, once again, is a 5 tefach amah. The definition of the corner of the Mizbeach is 5 tefach amos, okay? And then, as we're going to see in the Gemara, when it comes to the Mizbeach HaZahav, the entirety of the dimensions of the Mizbeach HaZahav were 5 tefach amas. So, according to Rava, when Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says that when it comes to kilayim, we're talking about 6 tefach amas, what's it coming to exclude? Where is it going to be 5 tefach amas? Specifically, when it comes to the Mizbeach, there were certain dimensions of the Mizbeach that were 5 tefach amas. When it came to the Mizbeach Chitzon, when it came to the Mizbeach HaZahav, it was entirely 5 tefach amas. So now let's read it inside. So it's Limute Amah Yisod va'amah Sovev. The 1 amah height of the Yisod was a 5 tefach amah, as well as when the Sovev turned inward at 90 degrees to get to the next section of the Mizbeach that may have been called the Zer or something, or I can't remember, but that was a 5 tefach amah as well. The Chsiv, as the pasuk says, Ve'ela midos ha-mizbeach. This is the pasuk in Yechezkel. These are the dimensions of the Mizbeach. Be'amos ama v'tofach. When we're talking about the amahs by the Mizbeach, we're talking about an amah v'tofach. What does it mean, an amah v'tofach? It means essentially that we're talking about 5 tefach amahs. But what the pasuk is saying is that in general, an amah would be 6 tefachim. However, the amos that we're talking about here in this pasuk are 5 tefach amos. Amos that in order to get to your normal sized amah, your 6 tefach amah, you would need to have one of these amas, i.e. 5 tefachim, plus another tefach, 6, which would get you to your normal 6 tefachim, right? So it's amah v'tofach. It's the kind of amah that you would need one of them plus another tefach to get to a normal 6 tefachim sized amah. V'chei ka'amah, ve'amah rochav, u'gvula el sfasa saviv zeres ha'echad, v'zegav amizbeach. That is the pasuk. We're about to break it up. Chei ka'amah ze yisod. When the pasuk says chei ka'amah, that's referring to the height of the yisod was 1 amah, 1/5 tefach amah. Ve'amah rochav ze sovev. When it says 1 amah of rochav, that's talking about where the sovev goes inward in amah, right before it gets to the next section of the mizbeach. And that inward amah was a 5 tefach amah. Ugvula el sfasa saviv elu akranos. When it says the borders at its lip, that is the horns at the top of the mizbeach. Those were also defined by 5 tefach amas. V'zegav ha-mizbeach ze mizbeach hazav. That when it talks about this is the top of the mizbeach, it's talking about the mizbeach hazav. That all of the amas, when it comes to the mizbeach hazav, were 5 tefach amas. So bigadol, Abaye says that it's machlokas tanoim when it comes to sukkah and mavoi. If you're going to use a 5 tefach amah. According to Rava, everyone agrees that it's always going to be a 6 tefach amah. The only time when it's a 5 tefach amah is by the mizbeach. Okay. Amar B'chia bar Ashi Amar Rav. It says of B'chia bar Ashi in the name of Rav. Shi'urin chatzitzin u'mechitzin alach l'Moshe misinai. That when it comes to measures, when it comes to chatzitzas, like impediments when you're going to the mikvah, and when it comes to separations, walls, Halacha l'Moshe misinai, these are governed by Halacha l'Moshe misinai. Fine. So, Shi'urim de'oraisu, the Gemara says, wait a second. Shi'urim, measurements, that's not a Halacha l'Moshe misinai. We learned that out from a pasuk. Pasuk in last week's parsha, Parshas Eikev. Tichsev, as the pasuk says, it's eretz chita u'so'or v'gomer. It's a land of wheat and barley, etc. V'amar of Chanan, and it says of Chanan, kol pasuk hazeh l'shi'urin ne'amar, that every single one of the 7 species, we can learn out a different measurement from it. Chita, what do we learn out from wheat? We learn in the Mishnah, nichnas l'vayis hamenuga, if a person walks into a house that has tsaras, v'chelev aksefa v'sandalav v'tabosav biyadav, and his clothing is on his shoulder, i.e. he's not wearing it, it's just folded up on his shoulder, v'sandalav v'tabosav biyadav, and he's carrying his shoes, and he's carrying his rings, huveim tmein miyad. So the instant that he walks into that house that has tsaras, he becomes tameh, his clothing, his rings, his shoes, everything becomes tameh. Because somebody walks into a house that has tsaras becomes tameh, as well as objects will become tameh. What if he was wearing his clothing, and he was wearing his shoes, and he was wearing his rings? Well, in that case, hu tameh miyad, so he still becomes tameh immediately. Ve'ein tahorin, however, the things that he's wearing remain tahor, ad sheyashe b'chdei achilas pras, until he remains in that house for long enough that it would take to eat a pras. Now, a pras is half of a loaf of bread of 8 eggs, right? A loaf of bread that would be the size of 8 eggs, it's half of that. So, i.e., it's the amount of time to eat 4 eggs worth of bread. Paschitim v'lo pasorin, the bread that we're talking about is wheat bread, not barley bread. Mesav bocha beliftan, and the amount of time it would take you to eat it while you are leaning and eating it with some kind of a dip. So, the shear that comes from wheat is the amount of time you have to wait in a bayis hamunuga before your clothing that you're wearing will become tameh. Se'ora, what measure do we learn out from barley? Titnan etzem k'se'ora mitami b'mago v'masa v'enu mitami b'o'el. That a bone the size of a kernel of barley will be matame if you touch it and if you move it, but not be'ohel. So if you are in the same room as a bone of a dead person that's the size of a barley kernel, so you will not become tummy. But if you touch it or if you move it, you will become tummy. Gefen kidei revi'as yain l'nazir. What we learn out from grapes are that if a nazir drinks a revi'as of wine, well then he will get lashes. Te'ena kigrogres leotzas Shabbos. What we learn out from figs is, as we know from Masechta Shabbos, that whenever the Chacham had a shear ochlin on Shabbos, it was always a grogeres. So if you take out a grogeres with you to Rishus HaRabim from Rishus HaYachid on Shabbos, you will be chayav. Rimon, what do we learn out from pomegranates? Kedetnan kol klei ba'alei batim shi'un kerimonim, that any kalim, vessels of ba'alei batim, any vessels that are tameh, that get a hole in it, the size that is large enough for a pomegranate to fall through, then that kli will no longer be considered functional and it will be tahor. Now, as we learned in Shabbos, on Masechta Shabbos on Daf Tzadivav Mud Aleph, Rashi points out that this is Dafka talking about wooden vessels, but if they were earthenware vessels, then the shear would be an olive's worth. But anyways, we're saying that when it comes to these wooden vessels of Baalei Batim, so if there's a hole the size of a pomegranate, well then it will become tahor, it's not usable anymore. Eretz zeis shemen, what do we learn out from olives? Eretz shekol shiurea kazeisim, a land that all of the shiurim are measured in olives worths. What do you mean kol shiurea? Salka daitech v'aika hanida amaron. What do you mean all of the measures are olives measures? We just listed wheat, barley, grapes, figs. There's all sorts of measures. What do you mean it's only olives? Elaima eretz shirov shiurea kazeisim. No, it's a land where the majority of the measures are olives worth, and that's already more familiar. I mean, we see kazayas all over the show. Certainly a lot more than you'll see a grogeres or a rimon. Dvash, what's the shear that we learn out from Dvash? Kikoseves hagas l'yom kippurim. If a fellow eats a large date on Yom Kippur, so then we'll give him kares. V'tizbra. So that's the Gemara's kasha. The Gemara's kasha is, why are you telling me that the measures are Halacha Moshe Misinai? Clearly we're learning out from a pasuk, not from Halacha Moshe Misinai. So the Gemara answers, V'tizbra shiurin michtav ksive. The Gemara says, well, does it say these shiurim explicitly in the pasuk? No way, no how. What it says in the pasuk is wheat, barley, grapes. It doesn't say anything about staying and, hanging out in a house that has saras. No, rather, it's Halacha Moshe Misinai. How do we know that wheat is connected to hanging out in a house that has saras? How do we know that barley is connected to etzem kisa'ora? It's Halacha Moshe Misinai. We then beautifully found this pasuk where we could say, wow, it literally lists all these things. So if you want to, let's say, remember it, so you could say, okay, here's this pasuk. It's chita, sora, gefen, tena, rimon. Chita is ba'asam nuga, sora is etzem sora, gefen is revi'as yain the nazir. Kilu, this pasuk works out perfectly to be able to, connect all of these pre-existing Halacha Moshe Misinais to a pasuk. But the fact of the matter is that we know these shurim from Halacha Moshe Misinai, and we are then just applying them to this pasuk as a way to reference them easily. Chatzitzin d'oraisininu. The Gemara now asks the same kasha with regard to impediments when you're going to the mikveh, right? If you're going to the mikveh, you have to make sure that, let's say you're not wearing clothing, or you don't have anything that is separating between your body and the water. Dichsev, as the pasuk says, v'rachatz es kol b'saro. Pasuk says that a man who semen leaves his body, so he's got to go to the mikveh. And it says that he's got to wash his entire body. That there shouldn't be anything that is separating between his flesh and the water. So we see already from a pasuk in the Torah that there shouldn't be any chatzitzas. The Brisa continues, B'mayim, what do we learn out in water? B'mei mikveh, that it can even be a mei mikveh as opposed to mayim chaim, as opposed to a spring. It can even be gathered waters. Of with whatever halachas apply to that, but it can be gathered waters. Kol b'saru b'mayim shekol gufa. Kol b'saru mayim shekol gufa ole bayad. What does it mean? All of his flesh? It has to be enough water that his entire body can fit in it. B'chamahein. How much is enough water that his entire body can fit in it? Amah al amah birum gimel amas. If there is sort of some kind of container or whatever, basically you're going to the mikveh in a place that is 1 amah by 1 amah in width and at a height of 3 amos. That is enough to get your whole body in. V'shiaran chachamim me mikveh mem sa'a. Chachamim said that the minimum requirement of water for a mikveh is 40 sa'a. Okay? So how can Rav Chanan be saying that, how could Rav Chia bar Ashi Amar Rab be saying that chatzitza is halacha Moshe Misinai? We learn on chatzitza from this pasuk where we say that there can't be any chatzitzas. Ki itztu chilchasa l'sayro. So the Gemara answers, the halacha Moshe Misinai by chatzitza is regarding your hair. Uchderabba bar Rav Huna, Ta'amar Rabba bar Rav Huna, Nima'achas kshura chotzetzes, shalosh enon chotzetzos, shtaim eni yodea. So let's read it again. So it's like Rabba bar Rav Huna who said, Nima'achas kshura chotzetzes, that if a person's hair has a knot in it, right? A person has a long strand of hair, and that hair is tied in a knot. Well, that knot is going to be a chatzitza because no water can get in there. Now, as we're going to see in a few minutes, it doesn't mean that if you have one strand of hair that has a knot in it, it's going to be a chatzitza. But if you have a lot of hair if most of your hair has a knot in it, we'll get to that in a minute. But at least, conceptually, a knot in one strand of hair is considered a knot that is able to make a chatzitza. Shalosh enon chotzitzos, but if you have 3 hairs that are all tied into one knot, well then it won't be a chatzitza because they wouldn't be able to make a tight enough knot and water can get through. Shtaim eni yodea, but if you have 2 hairs that are tied together in a knot, he says he doesn't know if that would be a chatzitza or not. Siron knew, so we see that what's Halacha Moshe Misinai coming to teach us? Not the concept of chatzitzas. We know the concept of chatzitzas from that first pasuk. It's coming to teach us that if you have a knot in one strand of hair, so that will be considered a chatzitza. Sayronami d'oraisa. But the Gemara says, but that's also mid'oraisa. We know mid'oraisa that if you have one hair that has a knot in it, it's going to be a chatzitza. The Tana, as we learn in a brisa, v'achatz that's called b'saro, that he has to wash all of his flesh. It's a tafel of b'saro, even that which is tafel, even that which is secondary to his flesh, v'zeu seyar, and that is hair. So we also see that hair can be a chatzitza, even if, meaning even his hair needs to go into the mikvah, and therefore if there's a knot in there and no water can get through, it's going to be a chatzitza. So we see that that hair is also mid'oraisa. So the Gemara answers that, okay, you know what the Halacha Moshe Misinai is teaching us? It's teaching us about rov and miut and being makbid and not being makbid. What does this mean? It's like Rabbi Yitzchak to Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, Dvar Torah, says Rabbi Yitzchak that we have Halacha Moshe Misinai, and there's an interesting Rashi over here. The Rashi says, what does it mean Dvar Torah? Halacha Moshe Misinai b'Torah sheba'al peh. So Dvar Torah, it's a Halacha Moshe Misinai. It's a Halacha that we have from Moshe from Sinai regarding Torah sheba'al peh. So it's like a thing of Torah sheba'al peh that we have this tradition that was handed down orally from Moshe from Sinai. So Rubo u'makbid alav chotzetz, v'she'eno makbid alav eno chotzetz. So the halacha Moshe Misinai is that if you have a majority that you care about, that would be a chatzitza. So let's say going back to our case, we said that if you have a hair that has a knot in it, that would be a chatzitza. It doesn't mean that if you have one hair that has a knot in it, that would be a chatzitza. That would be kind of insane. How can you know for sure that you don't even have one hair that has a knot in it? What it means is that if you have a majority of your hair that has a knot, that each hair has a knot in it, and not only that, but you have to be makpid on it, right? It would have to bother you. You would have to say, I don't like that a majority of my hair has knots in it. So in that case, it would be a chatzitza. That if the majority of your hair has knots in it, and you don't like that, that would be a chatzitza. Or if, let's say, the majority of your hair got some kind of a dirt in it, and now it's all stuck together, and you're not a fan of that. So that would be a chatzitza. You'd have to remove that before going into the mikveh. Either just by removing the dirt or the knots or cutting it off, whatever it might be. V'gazu arubo she'eno makbid mishumubo amakbid. And then the Chachamim then made a gezerah when you have a chatzitza in a majority of your hair, but you don't care, so that would be fine. If you have a majority of a chatzitza in your hair and you don't care about it, so since you don't care about it, you can go into it's fine, it's not a chatzitza. However, the Chacham said, even when you don't care about it, you should still remove it. It's a gezerah because maybe then in a case where you do care about it, you might not remove it because you thought that it just doesn't matter. There are no chatzitzas. So therefore, even when you don't care about it, you still have to remove it out of concern for a case when you have a majority that you do care about. And also if you have if you have this chatzitza in a minority of your hair, but you are makpid on it, so then even though technically speaking, it wouldn't be a chatzitza, we still say remove it out of concern when you have a majority that you do care about. V'ligzor nami al miyuto she'eno makpid. Then the Gemara asks, okay, now why don't we also make a gezerah when you have this chatzitza in a minority of your hair and you're not makpid about it? Mishum miyuto amakpid. Because of when you have a minority of your hair with the chatzitza that you care about, right? We said when you have a minority of your hair that you care about, so then it would be a chatzitza, you have to remove it. So let's also say that when you have a minority of your hair that you don't care about, you'd have to remove it out of concern for when you have a minority of your hair that you do care about. Or for when you have a rove of your hair, but you don't care about it, we still say that you have to remove it. So let's say also when you have a minority that you don't care about, you have to remove the chatzitza out of concern about when you have a majority that you don't care about. So my answer is higufa gzera v'anonekum v'nigzor gzera l'gzera, right? When it comes to a minority that you care about or a majority that you don't care about, Meikar adin, there's nothing wrong with that. The only problem is when you have a majority that you do care about. A majority that you don't care about and a minority that you do care about, the fact that we say to remove the chatzitza is only a gezerah. So to then go one step further and say that when you have a minority of your hair that has a chatzitza and you don't even care about it, you should have to remove that chatzitza out of concern for when you have a minority that you do care about or a majority that you don't care about. And those are already just gezerahs out of concern about a majority that you do care about. So to go ahead and make an additional gezerah, so you don't come to a different gezerah, we're not going to make a gezerah on a gezerah. New friends, bottom line, what do we see? That the Halacha Moshe Sinai, when it comes to chatzitzin, is regarding the fact that when you have a chatzitza in a majority of your hair and you care about it, then you have to remove that before going to the mikveh. Mechitzos, what is the Halacha Moshe Sinai when it comes to mechitzas? So we say mechitzas d'oraisa ninu. So again, we say mechitzas are also midoraisa. How do we know that mechitzas are d'oraisa? What about mechitzas? The fact that a mechitza needs to be, that a wall needs to be 10 tefachim tall. So the Gemara wants to argue, we already know that a wall needs to be 10 tefachim tall from the Torah. We don't need a Halacha Moshe Sinai. The Amar Mar, because we said, Aron tisha v'chaporas tefach, hare kanasara. That the Aron, right, the pasuk says that the Aron, the height of the Aron was 1.5 amos. Now, we know, of course, that an amah was 6 tefachim, and at least that's the assumption right now. The amah was 6 tefachim, and therefore, an amah and a half is 9 tefachim, and the kapores, which was the covering of the Aron, was another tefach, so that's 10 tefachim. And as Rashi points out, that we have a few interesting psukim. We have one pasuk that says, Hashamayim Shemayim LaHashem Va'aretz Nasan L'Vnei Adam, that the heavens are for God and the earth is for man. And we have another pasuk that says, V'no'adati l'cha me'ala kapores, that God says that I will speak to you from upon the kaporas of the Aron. Basically, right above the Aron, God would speak to Moshe. Now, of course, as the first pasuk of Ashmaim Shemaim Lashem Ba'aretz Nasav Bnei Adam, that God wouldn't come down to the ground; He would remain in the heavens. Which means that if we're saying that the Aron was 10 tefachim tall, and God would speak to Moshe on top, right above the Aron, that must mean that the heavens go all the way until 10 tefachim from the ground, but the 10 tefachim from the ground and up, those 10 tefachim are part of the land, and therefore the definition of a wall that basically demarcates areas of land, that wall is going to be a 10 tefach wall. So we already see that a wall is 10 tefachim. The definition of the height of a wall is 10 tefachim from the Aron, and the fact that God would speak to Moshe from right above the Aron. So the Gemara answers, Lo tzricha Rabbi Yehuda de Amar Amas Binyan ba'ama bas Shisha, Amas Kelim ba'amas bas Chamisha. So the Gemara answers, well, the Halacha Moshe Misinai to tell us that a wall is 10 tefachim tall is according to Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda says Amas Binyan, that when it came to an amah of building things, ba'ama bas Shisha, that was a 6 tefach amah. So when it came to let's say the krashim, the beams that were used to build the Mishkan, those were 6 tefach amas. But amas kelim ba'amas bas chamisha. When it came to the kelim, like the menorah, the shochan, the aron, those were 5 tefach amas. Which means, therefore, that the aron, we're saying it was 1.5 amas tall. That's just 7.5 tefachim. Plus the kaporos was another tefach, so 8.5 tefachim. So that just teaches me that the aron was 8.5 tefachim. I can't apply a wall to that. I can't know then that a wall is 10 tefachim. From the Aron, I would only know that a wall needs to be 8.5 tefachim, according to Rabbi Yehuda. So therefore, I need the Halacha Moshe Misinai to tell us that a wall needs to be 10 tefachim. But what about according to Rav Meir, who says that all of the amahs that we're talking about were 6 tefach amahs, which means then that the Aron was 9 tefachim tall, plus the kaporos is 10 tefachim. So I can learn out from the Aron that a mechitza, a wall, needs to be 10 tefachim tall. So then, why do I need the Halacha Moshe Misinai? So the Meir ki asay ilchasa leguru lelavur ledofen akuma. According to Rav Meir, the Halacha Moshe Misinai, when it comes to mechitzos, are regarding good, right? We've seen before good achis, good asik, right? That a wall can go up, an imaginary wall can go up, an imaginary wall can go down, right? Lovewood, of course, that walls that have a separation, a breach of less than 3 tefachim can be considered closed. Dofen akuma, which we learned the other day, which is that a wall can be considered bent at a 90-degree angle to consider the roof part of the wall. So those are all Halacha Moshe Misinai. Okay, friends, that was Daf Daled of Masechta Shabbos. Let us review what we learned. So at the beginning, we continued with the machlokas between Abaye and Rava regarding the size of a amah. Abaye says that when it comes to kilayim, the size of an amah is 6 tefachim. When it comes to sukkah and mavui, it's 5 tefachim. And we then brought a brisa in which the Tanakama, in which Abaye would argue that his assertion is actually machlokas Tanaim, and he holds like Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, that in this brisa, Tanakama holds that all amas are 6 tefach amas, but Reb Shimon ben Gamliel says that only by kilayim it's a 6 tefach amma, implying that by sukkah and mavui it would be a 5 tefach amma. And according to Abaye, it's machlokas Tanaim, and he holds like Reb Shimon ben Gamliel. Now Rava argues on Abaye's explanation and says, no, actually, the entire brisa, both Tanakama and Reb Shimon ben Gamliel, agree with him that the amma that we're talking about is that in general, when we talk about an amma, it's a 6 tefach amma. Now, when Reb Shimon ben Gamliel mentions 6 tefachim in an amma, that is to exclude something else. To exclude by the Mizbeach. That by the Mizbeach Achitzon, certain amos were 5 tefach amas. By the Mizbeach Azav, all of the amas were 5 tefach amas. But when it comes to kilayim, when it comes to sukkah, when it comes to mavui, we're always talking about 6 tefach amas. Then the Gemara went on and said that shiurin, chatzitzin, and mechitzin, measures and impediments and walls, are Halacha Moshe Misinai. So when it comes to shiurin, that's talking about like the wheat for the house that has tsaras, the barley, etzem kisora, all that stuff is Halacha Moshe Sinai. Chatzitzin, it's talking about when you have a majority of your hair has some kind of, let's say, dirt in it or knots, and it bothers you, well then you have to make sure that you remove those impediments before going to the mikveh. And when it comes to mechitzin, it's talking about good, it's talking about lavud, it's talking about dofen akuma. These halachos are Halacha Moshe Sinai, friends. That was Daf Daled of Masechta Ayruvin. Hope you enjoyed. Peace out.